Okay. So, as I said in the outline in the previous document, over the next 3 weeks or so, broadly, we are going to be covering three different threads, which I had tried to outline in those notes on academic writing. So, it's more like a table of contents rather than a discussion by itself. So, for most of this week, we'll talk about the approaches to argumentation, which you can incorporate both in your writing and your public speaking. And I'm going to take you through a presentation which I actually created a few years ago for the purpose of introductions to competitive debating. But I've modified it slightly in terms of what we require when we start judging the writing of seminar papers or dissertations. So we'll work through this presentation over the three classes, next 2 or 3 classes. After that, as I said in my outline notes, we'll spend some time on how to organize your literature review a bit more tightly. I know that Dr. Uma has spent some time on how to do targeted searches and retrieve material that is relevant to your research questions. But I'll focus a bit more on databases which prioritize legal sources. Some of them were mentioned in the document which I had shared with you. So obviously, since we have the option of screen sharing, we'll look at some of these prominent databases in the class hours and think about how we can organize the material for our respective purposes. So apart from this discussion on reasoning and argumentation, which I think will take the next 3 or 4 classes, then we'll spend 2 or 3 classes on the database searches and the organization of your literature, after which we will proceed to citations. What are the norms of citation? How should we approach citation when it comes to seminar papers in NALSAR and even writing generally? And then towards the end of the month, we'll spend a few classes just to again focus on the expectations in your research proposals and your seminar paper. So some of the readings which I've shared with you are more for general reference, but there are some extracts that we will refer to from time to time. So I hope that the time spent in outlining the content and the time spent in just trying to present a checklist of steps which you should consider will then make more sense to you at the end of this month as we cover this content. So just to get started, let's begin with a slightly more open-ended question. And let me put it to you in terms of not just the purpose of writing, but the idea of deliberation, which is, I'm sure, an idea that you're also discussing in the law and justice class. Because much of the arguments for, let's say, reforming legislative processes or reforming administrative processes are based on the premise that decision making on behalf of the state should become more deliberative. Now, obviously, at the moment, we are living through a time where farmers in Punjab and Haryana, particularly, and of course, some other unions from other states, are unhappy with the recently enacted laws in Parliament. And one of the major criticisms that they are offering, apart from the substance of these laws, is the way in which these laws were passed in a hurry, right? That they were initially brought in as ordinances. And then even in Parliament, the established process of referring these bills to a standing committee, then inviting public comments and incorporating them was not really followed, right? We even had a controversy about how the bills were passed in the Rajya Sabha because the opposition MPs were demanding a voice vote, but the speaker decided to, sorry, I beg your pardon, the opposition MPs were demanding a division of votes, which is an actual vote, whereas the speaker conducted a voice vote. So it's a pretty controversial set of legislations, not just because of the changes that it seeks to bring in the agricultural sector in India, but there are also arguments about the process which was used to enact these laws. So you can see many resonances or many connections between the broader discussion on deliberation and the way in which we evaluate decision making by the executive branch, by the legislature, and even to some extent the courts. The courts may not primarily be instruments of public deliberation, but there is an emphasis on the quality of arguments which are made inside the courtrooms, because eventually the decision that is going to come from a particular bench or a particular court will rely upon the quality of submissions made by the lawyers. So obviously we have to think in a slightly more stratified and slightly more nuanced way when we talk about deliberation in different sectors of governance. But by and large, it's an idea that seems to be pretty important or central to the understanding of a democracy. So which is why I felt that it might be useful for us to, again, work backwards, think about why we engage in the act of public deliberation, and then try and relate it to what we are doing in the university context or in the scholarly context, right? So let's begin with an open-ended question. What exactly, in your mind, are the objectives of public deliberation? And I've tried to suggest some answers. Let's see if some of you have other ideas. One older debate, let's say, which goes back to Plato and Aristotle and the ancient Greek scholars, is whether the real objective of public deliberation is truth seeking, that the process of discussion or the process of engaging in a dialogue with people who may come from different backgrounds, different experiences, is to somehow arrive at the truth, or is the objective of public deliberation consensus building? And even though I am using the word or, truth seeking or consensus building, obviously it's not necessary that these two are opposite categories, right? Sometimes you try to build a consensus around, let's say, a discussion which requires the search for the truth. But as we see in the age of disinformation and propaganda and false news being circulated through WhatsApp groups and social media, these days, very often, consensus building is in itself held out as an objective of public deliberation. So how else will you rationalize, let's say, electoral results where the popular media might be trying to convey, mainstream media might be trying to convey a certain opinion about a given party or a given set of policies, but the deeper social networks, which are becoming stronger with time and technology, are focused more on the prevailing consensus, which caters to people and prejudices. So this is, of course, a much larger question that we are grappling with in our mass communication these days. But even, let's say, from the point of view of an academic or aspiring academics like you, it's an important question to consider, right? Am I really engaged in the process of deliberation because I want to investigate the material in front of me, because I want to work towards what I think could be the truth? Or my real objective is to ensure that there is an underlying consensus or an overlapping consensus amongst the people whom I interact with? So depending on the social situation that you find yourself in, you might actually find that the emphasis on each of these objectives varies. For instance, if you're the head of an organization like a sports team or a small university such as Nalsar, or for that matter, even your batch group, then sometimes it might be more important to take the discussion towards a workable consensus, where despite our differences, despite our disagreements, we find some common ground which can then translate into action. But there could also be situations where such acts of consensus building are actually quite dangerous and need to be questioned. After all, the observance of customs or traditions, which also often reflect discriminatory attitudes towards minorities or discriminatory attitudes towards women, for that matter, do need to be questioned. They can't simply be assumed. So when we begin the discussion in this open-ended way, by asking whether the objective of public deliberation is truth-seeking or consensus building, I'm not expecting you to come up with a yes or no answer. I don't think that's the approach that we need to take. The more serious set of questions are, how does this balance change depending on the social, economic, or political arrangement which I'm looking at or which I'm part of at the moment? And this is, I think, a central question that must inform our thinking about communication in whatever form, in terms of speech, writing, images, in whatever other form you might choose. But possibly a more instrumental way of thinking about this, what are the purposes of public deliberation, can be addressed in this form. It could be to teach. The objective of public deliberation is perhaps to disseminate information, to disseminate certain points of view, or to encourage the development of the capacity for reflective thinking and coherent reasoning. In some situations, the objectives of public deliberation are actually may not be to teach, but maybe more to delight or entertain your audiences, as we see in the case of theater or even films, or for that matter, even advertising, where the real objective is not so much to disseminate information or to encourage the capacity for critical thinking, but more in the nature of entertaining the crowd, right? Or appealing to what the mass thinks is enjoyable. A third objective, which we associate more with political leaders and more so with, let's say, the current prime minister, is the ability to move people to action. This is, of course, important not just in the political scenario, but also in any organizational scenario where leadership is an important instrument of getting people to act and move. So you may say that one of the objectives of public deliberation is that if you make decisions through proper consultation, through an adequate consideration of different points of view, people are more likely to accept those decisions because they feel they have a voice in the system. But when you have situations such as the one arising around the farm bills, or for that matter, even around the CAA, where laws have been made without adequate public consultation, without serious consideration of the impact on constitutional principles and practice, there you might obviously have a case for some sections of the population to feel that their voices have been ignored, they are being targeted, and hence they have chosen the path of protest. So again, the entire question of whether or not protests are justified takes us into a deeper moral controversy. So we'll try and talk about that later in our classes. But okay, I'm not sure if my camera is working, but I hope my sound is carrying through because my camera seems to have stopped, right? But as long as the sound is carrying through, I think we can carry on with the class.
Yes, Siddharth, very audible. Yeah, your video we just lost your video, but yeah, the sound is better.
Yeah, no, I think this my camera is hanging up, but as long as the sound is carrying, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we look at the objectives of public deliberation, as I said, we have to be attentive to the kind of institutions that we are participating in, what kind of organizational setting we are part of. But obviously, there are certain objectives that transcend what these organizational contexts might entail. For instance, whether it is career politicians or whether it is movie stars, or for that matter, whether it is religious or spiritual leaders, these are some examples of people who are often given a public platform and are able to communicate with larger audiences. So, which is why perhaps some of these objectives are thought about with a bit more depth than others. So let me move to the next slide. The slide seems to be working. So when we talk about the objectives of oratory, there is an older classification given all the way back by Aristotle, who was one of the well-known ancient Greek scholars. Those of you who have studied political theory in your undergraduate course might remember that some of Aristotle's books had survived in the medieval period, which is why we still have translations available to us of Aristotle's most important works in published form. So whether it is Aristotle's Politics, his book called the Nicomachean Ethics, or his book on aesthetics, these are texts which have survived. Of course, they were originally written in Greek, but medieval scholars were able to translate them into English, French, and Spanish and Italian. And of course, now we have these works available all over the world. So Aristotle, in one of his works, in fact, I think it was in the ethics book, the Nicomachean Ethics, he had classified the purposes of oratory around 3 categories. And I think these categories are relevant even in the modern age, despite the changes in the nature of communication that we are dealing with. So I think the first category is something that we identify with more in the law school setting, but also when people study communication or language studies, as Dr. Uma will tell you, since her field is language training. So one objective, of course, is the forensic objective, which in the narrow sense means the way in which you present evidence in order to establish the truth or to establish the facts. So forensic oratory basically would mean that you're trying to present compelling evidence before your audience. You're trying to draw attention to certain facts, and you're trying to establish why people should believe them to be true, right? So it's important for judicial settings in order to pursue justice, where truth seeking is the primary objective. So yesterday we did speak about the different uses of the word evidence, that evidence is used in a legalist sense when we talk about eyewitness testimony, documentary evidence, material evidence or physical evidence in different forms. But the idea of forensics also has a slightly broader implication in the social sciences, where we are not limiting ourselves just to the actual production of evidence in court, but to the larger strategy of argumentation, which would be relevant for establishing any proposition. So in that sense, the word forensics also has a slightly deeper meaning, which you can become familiar with as you explore the literature in other disciplines, right? So you could say that this is perhaps one understanding of public speaking or oratory that we get accustomed to, especially when, as law students, you study the law of evidence or the law of criminal procedure, because much of it deals with the way in which documents, eyewitness testimony, physical forms of evidence such as blood samples, sputum samples, semen samples are often brought as part of criminal investigations, right? In civil cases, much of the evidence is in the nature of documents. So this is one form of oratory, right? It's not the only form. Then the second form, which political theorists are more interested in looking at, and moral philosophers are more interested in looking at, is the deliberative form. And I would argue that when you enter the world of research, this is actually the form that you are most likely to be participating in. The deliberative form essentially, at one level, may talk about the utility of dialogue in a group. So to ensure expediency or practicality, there is a higher likelihood of acceptance of participatory decision making, where consensus building is the primary objective. So obviously here, the extract that I picked out is speaking about the value of dialogue in groups, where in spite of our differences, disagreements, or different points of view, we come together and we try and thrash out a possible solution or a possible course of action through a process of deliberation. Now, why am I saying that even academic work or scholarly work largely follows this model? Because you may not be trying to impose your decisions or your views on your audience, but you are at least trying to add a newer perspective, a newer set of arguments, or an exploration of existing information in a way that adds to the quality of the dialogue. So academic writing may not always be done with the objective of influencing policy or with the objective of creating information which can then be useful for public officials. But academic writing can also seek to pursue knowledge as an end in itself, right? Which is an idea that we began with and we have brought it up several times in the course so far. That there could be a intrinsic reason for pursuing knowledge, where knowledge is seen as an end in itself, and of course, there could be instrumental or practical reasons for pursuing knowledge, where the pursuit of knowledge leads to some other goals or objectives which you value. The third idea, which I guess is more relevant for religious or spiritual leaders, is epidictic, where public speaking or public conversation is more geared towards the objective of inculcating virtue. So you could say that religious or spiritual discourse possibly performs that function, but very often, or no, actually not very often, but in some cases, you often also come across leaders in politics, leaders in business, or leaders in other professions who often end up performing this function, even though it may not be their main role. So we do encounter these different kinds of oratory in the course of our lives, and which is why it might be useful to think about this classification, which Aristotle had come up with all the way back in 300 around 300 AD in ancient Greece, right? So then let's look at how some of the elements of argumentation were then characterized by some of these older Greco-Roman scholars. And this is again a category which is relevant even now, especially when we teach undergraduate students debating. This is possibly one of the first steps that we take, that even though you might be expected to follow a certain structure in your argument, remember there are also different reasons why some arguments prevail and some arguments don't prevail. So the most obvious form or the obvious component of argumentation is what we call the logical form, which is what we are going to concentrate on, which essentially invokes the reason and logic as a method of trying to persuade others or trying to strengthen what you have to say. And in Greek mythology, logos and mythos were actually two different creatures who were set in opposition to each other. So mythos is basically a reference to a creature who invoked beliefs or traditions in an uncritical manner, whereas logos is the polar opposite, who believes that decision making should happen on the basis of what we can rationalize and what we can observe. So in a way, this mirrors the distinction that Dr. Uma would have introduced to you earlier when she spoke about the distinction between the rationalist method and also the problem of traditional authority, which often undermines arguments based on reason. So I won't say much on this because it'll take us in a slightly different direction, but I think it's a pretty obvious distinction for students at your age group. But you know that not all arguments which are made in public, either in the courtroom or by politicians, or for that matter by religious or spiritual leaders, are based on logic. There are many communications which are actually based on the element of pathos, which essentially means the appeal to emotion or base instincts. Now, this could, of course, be seen in a positive light when people are trying to motivate large groups of people to believe in a certain view or to take a certain constructive action. But pathos can also be invoked to move crowds to act in a slightly harmful way, especially when we talk about the problem of mobs going haywire or majorities oppressing minorities. It's also possible that it is the result of strategic political communication, which has inculcated a fear of the outsider, a fear of the other, and has simply appealed to base instincts like fear or prejudice in order to move people to a harmful course of action. So we are not really saying that the element of pathos is value neutral. There are some public speakers who are able to use the element of pathos very well in conveying a certain sense of deprivation or a certain sense of exclusion. And there are others who are in fact able to use the element of pathos constructively to be able to motivate people to act on their best instincts. So it can actually work in different directions, which is the key point that I wanted to convey. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? The element of pathos can often be used strategically to pursue constructive ends, but it can also be used for harmful ends. The element of ethos is possibly what we associate more with moral philosophy, which is the idea that public speaking or writing or other forms of deliberation should eventually appeal to ethical judgments and the reflective capacities of the audience, and move the discussion away from a pure invocation of logical reasoning and a very broad application of a broad appeal to emotion. So all of these elements may be present in the kind of speeches that we construct or the kind of essays that we write. But as I said, in academic work, the primary focus is on the element of logos, right? Even when we are discussing the impact of emotions, even when we are looking at invocations of morality and other such subjective concepts, even there, the method of presentation that you would use should largely come within the logical form, which is why we focus on that, at least for the purpose of our courses. Now, I know that there are different ways of approaching these questions, and those, in fact, who are more well versed in the critical legal studies approach will say that why are you prioritizing reason? Ultimately, human beings are made up on the basis of their emotions or their subjective feelings, and it is increasingly important to give vent to those feelings and emotions and acknowledge them in scholarship, rather than switching the pendulum towards the element of reason. So this is, of course, another debate that has come up very prominently, especially in fields such as sociology and literature in the last 30 to 40 years. So before I move on, I just wanted to stop and pause because I've been going on and on in a monologue now for nearly 2 classes. So does anybody else have ideas on what could be the objectives of public deliberation? I mean, like I asked you in the previous set of notes, I had some ideas which I've put down, but again, no one's experience is, representative of what a larger group of people feels. So do you think that there are some other objectives which one should be considering, which may not really fit into any of these ideas or categories that I've put forward? So I'll just pause there and ask if anyone has anything to say or add. Or do you think that this central division between truth-seeking or consensus building will help us in navigating the difficulties that we often find in any deliberative setting, right?
Yes, sir. I do feel like that public deliberation is very much a part of a vibrant democracy. It's not only help in consensus building, but it also help in seeking the inputs from the general public. But because ultimately it's the public who will be affected by the legislation, so it's necessary that the inputs from the public should be taken at the outset itself. So to see that whether the legislation in effect has the same kind of impact intention, or whether it will have some side effects that may not be in the intention of the legislature, but it will have a different kind of impact on a certain section of the people. So it has to be a deliberative effort.
Okay, so I think you're building on the thread of consensus building to say that it's not sufficient just to indicate agreement to a particular policy or a particular law or administrative measure, but that agreement should be built organically through processes of consultation, discussion, and very often, even if mistakes are made, right, even if an executive action, executive order is issued or a legislation is made, at least those holding positions of authority should be accountable to people by inviting feedback or suggestions on what can be done. And I guess the central idea which you have conveyed, which I think is an important addition to our discussion, is that sometimes the intent of the lawmaker or the intent of the administrator is not really the most important thing. Because eventually it is the impact of that law or the impact of that policy which decides the fate and future of people. And unless those who are likely to be affected by the groups are heard and consulted in advance, the particular law is likely to lack legitimacy, right? Which is, of course, the current debate about the farm legislations. But I take your general point that it may not just be consensus building, because consensus building suggests that in spite of our differences, we are coming to a common agreement, we are finding common solutions. There can be situations where consensus building is actually not possible, and the law actually works out what we call differentiated solutions, depending on the needs of different stakeholders. So I think that's an interesting idea which we should work with. And especially if you come to the field of Indian constitutional law, which is the field that I'm trying to study, you do have the idea of differentiating solutions playing out in many situations. For instance, the very idea of federalism has been thought about in a very different way in India, because there are special arrangements made for specific states based on their unique demographic or historical needs, right? Or for that matter, when we think about the philosophical justifications for policies such as affirmative action or protections for minority rights, we are fundamentally understanding that there are certain groups which, on account of historical deprivation, or by virtue of their minority status, require some institutional safeguards to be able to prosper in a modern democracy. So it's not just consensus building, which may inform, let's say, the movement towards action. But sometimes, even when you do announce a policy or you make a decision, you should be open to self-correction and accounting for feedback from those who are affected by that law. So I think that's a very useful addition to our discussion. That deliberation is not just about making that law or making that policy. It's also a continuous process which must be considered in any act of administration or governance. Any other views on what could be other objectives of deliberation, or do you think something else you might want to add to this discussion so far? You can also react to how Aristotle classified different forms of public speaking. I mean, oratory is literally public speaking, but I would argue that something similar also plays a role when it comes to writing, because the forensic setting is basically what you would do in a trial court to try and establish facts when you're trying to defend your client's interests. The deliberative setting, I think, in terms of public speaking, has more to do with persuading others, with participatory decision making. But even in the act of academic writing, you often engage in what is called the deliberative mode, because you want to add to the current debate or you want to add to the current discussion by making slightly distinctive points. So do you think, do you agree with my suggestion that that academic writing is similar to the act of deliberative public speaking, or do you think there are differences between the two? Okay. Anyway, so just let's think about it and let's build on how we can situate these categories in our own writing. Now, we've already spoken about the elements of logos, pathos, and ethos, which is a slightly simplistic way of thinking about the manner of argumentation that we choose. But let's come back to it when we start looking at some examples in the next couple of classes. Let's first talk about how we might actually organize, let's say, our presentations. So this category, which is called the classification of rhetorical skills, actually appears in a book written by Cicero, who was in fact a lawyer and a scholar in ancient Rome. And I told you about him that he was put to death by Mark Antony because he had frequently opposed Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And he had suggested that generally when you're looking at the quality of a public speech, you're looking for these criteria. And of course, these criteria may not directly relate to what you need to do now, but it does give you a useful tool to think about the qualities of public speaking. So what he means by invention of ideas is not the literal invention of new ideas, but how do you introduce the audience to a newer point of view or a newer set of arguments which they may not be familiar with. So ordinarily when we say that I'm bringing a certain idea for the consumption of the audience, or I'm trying to present a certain argument in a structured way, it's not invention in the literal sense. You are not the first person to come up with that idea, but you might be conveying that idea in a form that appears to be novel or distinctive to the audience in front of you. So that's what he broadly meant by the invention of ideas. But then he also laid careful emphasis on the arrangement of ideas, right? Questions of structure, which I was trying to flag yesterday, that when you state an argument or state a certain position, it's important to defend it with supporting reasons, examples, and then tie back the analysis that you develop to the original position that you're seeking to put forward. Style, of course, matters more perhaps in some forms of public speaking than others. But in a country where English is possibly our second or third language, I don't think we should worry so much about the style in which we are speaking the English language, except to say that the way in which we speak should be accessible to others. What we say should be understood, and they should at least interest your audience in engaging in a serious dialogue on the questions that you're considering. Delivery has more to do with the way in which you would speak in a public platform. So, for example, in school, you would be told that sometimes it's important to pause between sentences. It's important to establish a certain degree of fluency in a given language. But again, these elements, I would say, are not so important for us in the Nalsar context, because we would focus more on elements such as the arrangement of ideas, right? That would be the more important component when your presentations happen, either with your seminar paper or your dissertation. In any case, we'll talk in more detail about how to prepare for your presentations later in this year. The last element, according to him, is memory, because this is the older belief that if you speak without referring to a piece of paper, or if you speak from memory, it's more likely to impress others. But with lawyers, I think that's not necessarily true, because lawyers deal with multiple texts, multiple judgments, multiple citations at the same time. So I think this image of an orator who speaks without reference to a piece of paper is just an ideal. Very few people are able to do it. I think it is important for you to have your documents in order or your paper book with you when you present arguments in courts. So some of you, I'm sure, have done, and you can relate to what I'm saying, that when you are in fact before a bench in a moot court which knows the subject matter, it is important to have your background texts and materials with you in an organized way. So let's take on board a couple of comments that have come in. I have not responded to them. Okay, so I think Shweta had said that to tell one's viewpoint to the public and to judge public's opinion. Fine. So I agree with the first part that the objective of deliberation is to express your own point of view, is to bring your interests to the table. But in terms of judging public's opinion, again, you have to clarify from whose standpoint are you judging public opinion. Then Anushri has written, public deliberation plays a key role in improving and refining the policies or laws that the government intends to implement as a welfare measure, right? So I think that's building on what Mohammad Sikandar had said. So let's move on to another idea. Again, just to give you a sense of why certain forms of communication prevail at a given point of time in history, and why with the changes in the medium of communication, the nature of communication also changes. So for example, when we talk about epidictic oratory or oratory that is motivated to inculcate virtue, which is associated more with moral philosophy or religious discourse, there were reasons for why epidictic oratory had declined in ancient Greece. That's because as opposed to a certain period when this oratory was prevailing, where people were living in the city-states of Athens or Sparta or other such prominent states, gradually with the rise of agriculture and the improvements in agriculture, I mean modernization is the wrong word, with improvements in agriculture, you had a dispersal of the population from the city-states to distant villages. And as agriculture became more viable and crop cultivation became the main profession, the possibility of having a large consolidated audience for such oratory became less. So that was one reason that was documented, in fact, by people like Cicero, who was writing in the 1st century BC, who says this is why epidictic oratory had in fact declined in the ancient Greek city-states, whose history he was familiar with. So the broader point that I think we can analyze and discuss for our purpose is that creative pursuits are likely to flourish if they address a wider cross-section of aggregated interests, rather than smaller and discrete audiences who have tastes unconnected to those of others. So this is simply saying that art and literature are likely to flourish if they respond to the interests of a larger audience, which represent a diversity of views. Because the moment your audience gets broken up into smaller segments based on their different tastes and different interests, it becomes very hard for the artist or the writer or the speaker to address them. In fact, something similar is at work in the classroom setting as well. Now, at the time of teaching in the regular classroom, we assume that we have to say things which will be relevant and useful for the larger class. But very often, if the teacher decides to talk about a specialized topic of interest which motivates her or him, then you might end up alienating the class because much of the class may not really share the interests that you have. So this happens very often with teachers who are embedded in their own research, that very often the presentation of ideas or the presentation of examples has more to do with their own research, which might actually be a very effective way of teaching because you are more well versed with that material. But sometimes, depending on the kind of audience you have, you might lose the attention of your audience. So again, for a public entertainer, this becomes a pretty crucial point. How will you tailor your content or create your content in a manner that responds to the kind of audience that you have? For instance, think about the current debate. I mean, this is of course an older example, and you can flip the argument around also and say that sometimes when you're addressing a cross section of aggregated interests or a large audience, you're likely to say things which are dumber or say things which are simpler. Whereas when you talk to a smaller, more specialized audience, then you might be able to come up with a more refined message or more a deeper persuasive method of communication. So this point can also be argued the other way around, rather than accepting it as it is. But let's think about it in relation to a current debate that is happening between how cinema production houses should circulate their content during this age. So, for example, Warner Brothers came up with a decision that all of their movies in 2021, I think they're planning about 17 movies, are not only going to be released in theaters, but they will also be available for streaming on the same day. Now, this is a big departure from the older practice because earlier you would allow a movie to be shown in the movie theaters first because ticket sales would generate some revenue. And it is when ticket sales would start declining and the movies would be taken off from the theaters that you would then sell the rights to streaming services and then eventually to television before in the long run you would reduce the costs. Now, this is obviously tied to the way in which profits are sought to be made from commercial cinema. But the decision made by Warner Brothers to say that all 17 movies that they have planned in 2021 are going to be available for streaming straight away is obviously going to cut the possibility of people coming to the cinema halls, right? So even those who might have otherwise considered the possibility of going to the cinema hall, despite the pandemic, may then now choose to subscribe to the streaming services and watch the film there. So it has an impact on the economics of filmmaking. And Christopher Nolan has come out with a statement saying that Warner Brothers is making a mistake. They should stick with the current model of first letting the movie come on big screens and then sending it to streaming services after some time. Now, this also, remember, is touching on the debate of who will be your audience, right? Who is more likely to come to the movie theaters as opposed to who is more likely to watch the films on Netflix or on HBO Max, right? So the question is not so much about what is being put forward, what is being created, but how are you going to reach out to your audience? And in the longer run, depending on the kind of audience you're pursuing or depending on the audience that you get, will it then have an impact on what you're going to say in the future? So even in an industry as complicated as film production and film distribution, the sense of who your audience is basically going to determine the future of this industry. So some people are saying that HBO Max has taken the right decision because instead of losing all their revenues because people won't come to the theaters, they're at least trying to earn some money by giving the option of streaming on the same day. Whereas film purists like Christopher Nolan are saying that most of these films were made with the big screen in mind, and it's actually a misrepresentation to the audiences to make it available for streaming straight away. So again, these are debates which are more relevant in the films in this particular sector, but are connected to this point that was being made about how the quality of communication may improve or may suffer depending on the kind of audience you're speaking to. So the question that I would say we should abstract from this is which forms of communication are addressed to a mass audience and which ones are tailored for a small audience. I think it's important for you to think about this question and then connect it back to something that we said yesterday about how you would approach the structure of your paper, how would you approach the process of citation, because a lot of what you do in the writing of an academic paper should also be sensitive to the kind of audience that you're writing for. If you're writing an opinion piece in a newspaper, which is meant to be read by a general audience, then you must simplify jargon, you must explain professional and technical terms, you must use language which an average reader can understand, and you must also use examples and analogies which might resonate with the reader. However, if you are writing in a professional journal or a scholarly journal, where the expectation is that people who are already well versed with the subject are going to read the journal, then your approaches might be different, and then you might actually use more technical and professional language. So this is a crucial point which one can compare with other disciplines also, whether it is film production, whether it is theatre, whether it is mass media, which is what we'll talk about in more detail tomorrow or in the next class, I beg your pardon. But the general question is the one which I'm putting forward here, that how do you think about the purpose of your communication and who is going to be your audience? I think that's a pretty important consideration when you approach any act of academic writing. So let's just look at the next couple of slides before we close today. So by the 12th century, the evidence of rhetoric was available, which means that the subject of rhetoric was taught alongside grammar and dialectics as part of the liberal arts universities, as part of the liberal arts in European universities. The older universities such as Bologna in Italy or Oxford and Cambridge, which were set up in England as early as the 12th century, documents which have survived from that period show that subjects such as rhetoric, grammar, and dialectics were actually taught to students at the time. At that time, it was largely taught to people who were training to be priests. So largely it was taught in theological or ecclesiastical contexts, because sometimes even the act of writing or the act of knowledge production was limited to the priestly class in the medieval European societies. But in modern universities, obviously the subject of rhetoric is taught in many disciplines. Public speaking and forensics are usually taught as part of English language teaching, which is Dr. Uma's specialization, but they're also taught with a lot more rigor in media, journalism, and communication studies departments, because for them, of course, it is tied to their professional goals more clearly. So what we mean to say is that rhetoric, or the ability to construct arguments systematically, is something which can be learned. It can be taught, right? A lot of people, unfortunately, tend to believe that only people who have gone to convent schools or have gone to international schools have learned this art of rhetoric because their school curriculum had it. But what I want to say is that you can learn it at any step in your career, right? You can learn it at the undergraduate stage, you can learn it at the postgraduate stage, you can learn it as a doctoral student, you can learn it afterwards, right? After all, knowledge is not something that is to be compartmentalized by age, right, or status. It has more to do with your own motivation and your own desire to expand the range of skills available to you. So this is just to give you some background context. And the question that I guess is linked to the previous question about who is your audience is that is rhetoric enabled by the design of public places and platforms or the opportunities which are available for discussions. So for instance, in ancient Greece, you had the agora or the open public space where people could come and deliberate and discuss. Then, of course, even now you have public squares, you have town halls, you have university settings, modern legislatures and social movements, which largely work around the logic of enabling a discussion or a dialogue amongst those who have different interests or different points of view. Apart from direct communication through public speaking and discussion, you obviously have communication in the written form. So printed pamphlets, which came in the medieval period, soon after the introduction of the printing press, played a major role in the reformation of Christianity and the emergence of the Protestant movements, beginning in Germany and then in other countries, because it became easier for those who were criticizing the Catholics to circulate their views by virtue of publishing pamphlets. Right prior to that, they would have had to rely upon handwritten notes or word of mouth communication. But the printing press made it easier for you to circulate your views by mass producing and mass printing them and then circulating the prints amongst a larger section of people. Similarly, when we come to the modern period, newspapers really came into their own in England in the middle of the 19th century, when newspaper owners started becoming more influential because more and more people were becoming literate and they were reading these newspapers. And hence, newspapers became an important tool for holding the parliament accountable in the middle of the 19th century in England, which is also a model that many of the post-colonial countries have tried to copy. And in our age, of course, you have the role of the broadcast media, the role of TV and radio, and how it changes your perceptions towards certain issues. One major thread which is discussed in the history of media studies is how the emergence of broadcast media in the 1960s actually played a big role in how public attitudes towards wars were shaped, right? So in the absence of broadcast media coverage, people were not really aware of what their own armies were doing in foreign nations. And the example of the Vietnam War is actually a central one because the Vietnam War was perhaps the first major conflict which was almost broadcast live or discussed on television on a day-to-day basis in the American cable TV networks. I mean, prior to that, also some very large wars took place, the Korean War, the Second World War, but the nature of news coverage was not so contemporaneous, right? Normally, people would have to wait for newsreels, which would reach them after many weeks of a particular event. And the newsreels would, of course, go through several levels of filtration and editing by government and journalistic establishments. But broadcast media changed the rules of the game because reporters from the prominent American networks could go into the Vietnamese villages, could go to Hanoi and report on the war based on what they saw. So much of the reason for why there was so much domestic opposition to the war in Vietnam is possibly linked to the fact that there was widespread broadcast coverage of this war. So, of course, in the 70s and 80s, there were many other conflicts, and this has become a very established argument that sometimes it is the nature of coverage of an armed conflict which improves the chances of peace building or a quick resolution to the war. Whereas if media ignores a certain conflict in some parts of the world, then it's quite likely that there will not be multilateral pressure to end the war or not enough reflection on the suffering and the horrific consequences of war. And these days, of course, we are living in the age of social media, instant messaging services, which have completely changed the way in which we consume information, how we circulate information. And it might also be doing several things to our psyche, which we are still yet to understand. So this is obviously a real challenge to the traditional theory of deliberation, because very often on social media, it becomes very difficult to verify the truth or the veracity of the forwards that you have been sent to you, or for that matter, even the content that you tend to share on your Facebook page, on your Instagram accounts or Twitter, is more likely to reflect your existing beliefs and prejudices rather than a willingness to engage in deliberation with others and to find a constructive solution. Which is why, as most of you would have found, having political arguments on Facebook is quite useless because that person who really has a certain established view will simply not change their mind. And because they know that their comments are being read by others in their family circle or their friend circle, very often, rather than listening to objective commentary or even the opinion of experts, people think that whatever they feel is right. So in that way, social media and WhatsApp might have actually entrenched the element of mythos, right, rather than the element of logos. So we have to now get into this discussion of what it takes to go back to the emphasis on logos in public communication. So there's a lot of writing and scholarship around the impact of fake news and disinformation and how social media might be rewiring our minds. And that could potentially be a research topic for some of you as you plan your dissertations, either on the broadcast sector or on social media. So I'll stop there because I think we've used up our time. There is some more discussion on deliberative spaces and the larger questions around the approach towards argumentation. But then we move into some practical exercises where we will look at the components of an argument through examples. I think that's probably the skill which you need to develop and demonstrate in your writing. So I think I'll go through that content a bit slowly. And our next session, I think, is on Friday at 11 o'clock. So I think I'll close there unless somebody wants to add something or has a question. Okay, so in any case, this content is with you. The files are with you, so you can take a look at them, think through it. If something is not clear, please note down your questions or you can send me an email. And obviously, as we go through it, you are more than welcome to raise interventions or ask questions in the class as well, right? So I'm going to stop the sharing of the content, and I guess this is the last class for you today.